Hello everyone! Today we're going to discuss principles of program design, which can be applicable in regards to prehabilitation, to rehabilitation, to actually training high-performance athletes in their preparation for competition. When it comes down to program design, one size does not fit all. As we know, there's lots of individual variability among people and how they respond to a program. And you cannot design a cookie cutter program, which happens quite regularly, in which someone creates a program and they use it for all their clients. Or you create one program and you use it for the entire team of athletes. This is a cookie cutter approach, and it's not going to make you a good trainer. In order for you to design a good program, you need to assess the individual and make a program that suits their needs. And it may be this form of progression and regression, that you're progressing certain athletes or certain clients at a faster rate, or you're regressing them and you're slowing them down and you're bringing them back to the basic movement patterns, and then you're progressing them in the optimal pattern for that individual. There are three main goals of a program design. Firstly, to prevent injuries. Secondly, to enhance the ability to tolerate the demands of what that person is exposed to. And this is by developing a system capacity and structural tolerance. And lastly is to enhance performance. So these three goals should be the center of your program design. You want to ensure that you're creating a robust athlete that is injury-free and who can tolerate the demands of the sport well, with an enhancement in their performance. There is a process prior to program design, and it's a 6-step process, which you can see here dictated by arrows, which I believe is the best way to create a program. First of all, at the top, you can see we need to understand the physical demands of the sport. So this is called a sport demand or a needs analysis. Then the second part of this is you want to meet with the athlete, go over their history, and then create some goals together. Then you're going to do a physiological assessment. You're going to assess their physiology. Now, the caveat to this is that this approach is only for the assessment of physiology. So they might also want to consult with a sports psychologist, a dietitian, as well as a biomechanist to go over this aspect. But what we're going to talk about is more the program design, where we're assessing and prescribing exercise based on their physiology. So the third step is that physiological assessment or testing. The fourth is based on the test results, we want to do something called a gap analysis, which we're going to talk more about in the coming days. So we're going to do an athlete gap analysis, identify their performance factors, to train them based on the results of their tests as well as their goals. Then we're going to create a program from that information. And then what we're going to do is incorporate assessments throughout to monitor fatigue and adaptations. And this could be through baseline testing or a pre-test. It could be through mid-tests, as well as formative evaluations, and then the post-test to assess the effectiveness of the program. Ultimately, this 6-step process you need to be very familiar with, because it's going to be coming up and it is a theme that we're going to be covering throughout the entirety of this course. So make sure you know this process very well and use it. This could be used in physiotherapy and chiropractic, in training for athletes, for individual clients, whatever it may be. They don't have to be athletes, it could be general population, but this process ensures you're hitting all the aspects prior to creating a program. So let's briefly dive into that first step of the 6-step process, and that's understanding the physical demands of the sport, doing a sport or a needs analysis. So the question you need to ask yourself is, what are the physical demands of the sport your client is engaging in, or the activity that they're engaging in? So this could be you're doing a workplace assessment of their workplace. They're sitting all the time, or they have a standing desk, or whatever it may be. Or for an athlete population, you're assessing the physical demands of that sport. So in soccer, we have significantly different physical demands than in swimming, and that being different than what you find in cricket. So you need to understand the demands of that sport, the demands placed on the athlete, so you can be very specific in your exercise prescription. And this will help you ensure that the translation from training to impacting performance is optimized. So some of the questions you want to ask when you're doing a sport demands analysis is, firstly, what is the nature of the sport? Is it a collision or contact-based sport? Because that's a physical demand on the athlete. They need to be strong and resilient to be able to combat that collision or that contact. Is it a cyclic or acyclic sport? What are the physiological demands? You want to do a movement analysis. What are the planes of motion? What's the velocity of movements the athlete has to do? The duration of the movements, the length of competition. What does a year training plan look like? How many competitions are there? What's the demand on the body from a physiology standpoint? As well, what are the energy systems involved? Then we move into the common injuries. Are they overuse injuries, acute injuries, or chronic-based injuries? What are the environmental conditions? Land, is it played on land? Is it water-based, ice, air, wilderness? What's the temperature typically in a competition? And the humidity? Do they compete at altitude? What does your athlete compete at? And then looking at the phenotypes, so the body composition considerations. Is it a weight class-based sport? Is there an impact on performance from a body mass ratio impact? So what is there an importance on fat and lean body mass, or is there not? For example, in the sport of cycling, in order to be fast going uphill, you have to be able to push your weight. So you need a high power to weight ratio. So in that sport, it would be important, the phenotype and the body composition of the athlete during certain phases of their training cycle. So ultimately, the first step is to really understand the sport and the demands that are placed upon your athlete. So you can check off each of these demands and ensure you're building the athlete to maximize their performance within that specific nature of the sport. This first step is very important, not only for athlete training, but also for any client. If you're working with a general population in physiotherapy, you need to understand the physical demands that are placed upon that individual on a daily basis, so you can cater a program to meet the needs of that individual. This is a template that is typically used for a sport demands/needs analysis, where you want to determine the demands of the sport discipline or event by assigning a degree of importance to the variable. So as you can see, there's a listed variables on the left column, which is anaerobic power, anaerobic capacity, maximum lactate steady state, max strength. There's lots of things here: flexibility, speed, decision making, information processing. And what you do is you determine whether this is a key performance factor to the sport. Does it significantly impact performance? Is it a quantifiable measure used to gauge performance success in that sport over time? Then you assign whether it's of high importance, moderate importance, low importance, or not applicable to that sport. And then once you've classified each of these variables, you can determine what the main priority is for that sport. And once you've done that, then you can cater and you can design your program based on the demands, the key performance demands of that sport, which makes your prescription very specific. I highly recommend that if you're working with a client or anyone in sport, that you use this template to get a better understanding of the demands and needs of that sport before meeting with the individual. You get as much information as possible. You become a guru within that sport so that you can help that athlete the best you can do in catering a training program specific to their needs. Now we're going to move into talking about the second step of the 6-step process prior to program design, and that's meeting with the athlete, going over a detailed history and setting some goals. So the second step is to know your athlete, and this is the detailed history. So you want to know and you want to discuss with the athlete their previous injuries, their personal goals, their level of play. How long have they been competing at a recreational or an advanced, intermediate, or an elite level? Their training age. So I'm going to show you in later lectures how you can classify someone's training age. So their training age in sport, as well as with strength and conditioning experience, lifting weights and doing a formal training program, as well as you can understand their developmental age, their trainability, which we'll discuss on the coming slides, whether they're involved in other activities in sport, as well as what they're doing in their life, if they're at school, if they're working, what their work demands are, as well as getting a sport history. So what competitions they've been in, what their training has been like, what kind of results they've got. And you can do all that through developing a good rapport with your athlete or with your client through a good discussion with them. You also want to classify the trainability of an athlete. There's large variation in trainability, as defined by Bouchard et al. In 1997. As you can see on this figure, on the y-axis, we have magnitude of training response, and on the x-axis is time course of training response. As you can see, some people respond fast and large to training. So these are the typical people that you put them on a program and they adapt very quickly with a high response, but then it tapers off. You also have individuals who are fast adapters to a training program and learning skills, but they have a small response, which are the people indicated in blue here on the figure. Then you have people who are more a slow and large response, which is green, and then in yellow we see a slow and small response. So you want to kind of gauge with your athlete their trainability. So trainability refers to the faster adaptation to stimuli and the genetic endowment of athletes as they respond individually to specific stimuli and adapt to it accordingly. Ultimately, everyone has this window of trainability, which is defined as a critical period of development when training has an optimal effect. So where you see fast and large responses. This window of trainability does vary per person. An example of a period of accelerated adaptation is something called peak height velocity, which is a period where there's maximum rate of growth occurs. And it is the onset of peak height velocity that is the best determiner of when to increase the training focus on aerobic and strength development. This peak height velocity is usually during the periods of puberty in females and males. So if we look at this figure on the right-hand side of the screen, on the top we see females. And we see peak height velocity, PHV, happens at around 12 and a half, 13 years of age. So that's the maximum rate of growth. Okay, this is the period of accelerated adaptation leading into peak height velocity. And it's usually the time where you want to develop endurance as well as strength focus in female younger athletes. For males, peak height velocity happens a little bit later at around 13 and a half to 14 age. As you can see, it's usually around the peak height velocity where you really have this accelerated adaptations in endurance as well as strength, as well as speed. So the rate of growth and the rate of development is accelerated during these times. It's very important that you're aware of this period of accelerated adaptation, especially if you're working with younger athletes, because you may be working with athletes between the ages of 12 and 15 who are in that time of peak height velocity, where it is a period of accelerated adaptation. So you can train them a little bit differently, but you need to be aware of that, and this could affect their trainability and their ability to adapt to a stressor. The second part of step 2 is developing goals. So you're sitting down with your client and you together are developing some goals based on the physical demands of the job or of sport, in addition to their training and their history. And so you're developing these specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely goals. In summary, first off, we talked about the 3 main goals of designing a training program. 1, to prevent injuries, making a robust athlete. 2, to enhance system capacity and tolerance to the demands of the sport or activity, and to enhance their performance. Then we went into an overview of the 6-step process that you do prior to designing a training program. and we discussed the first two steps. The first step being a sport or needs analysis, where you're understanding the physical demands of the sport. That's going to be a reoccurring theme within this course, is really getting to a good grasp of step one. Step two is knowing your athlete, doing a detailed history, determining their training age, their trainability, and setting realistic and timely, specific, measurable goals with them. Thanks very much for your attention, and don't forget to do your week 2 quiz.